birds singing in the dead of night. Take these broken wings and learn to fly all your life. You were only waiting for this moment to arise.
Hi everybody, thanks so much for joining us. I'm your host, Josh Powers, and I am here to interview Sarah Reed, the Executive Director of the Autism Society of Connecticut. But first, I want to explain how unique this program is here at Cox Studio. All of our production crew today is on the Autism Spectrum, the young adults on the Autism Spectrum, and thanks to our friend Dave here at Cox Studio. We want to thank him for training all of our staff here for this unique opportunity, and we're truly enjoying ourselves. So please welcome now with me Sarah Reed, the Executive Director of the Autism Society of Connecticut, right?
Yes.
Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's great to be here. I'm so excited.
You were just saying you were actually the one that Dave went to originally for this unique opportunity.
Yes. I got the first phone call from Dave, who said he had this great idea, and I said it is a fabulous idea, and you need to call my friends over at the Autism Spectrum Resource Center, because I knew that they would be able to find the young adults who would be interested in doing this.
Yes.
And I said, and I will happily be your first interviewee.
Yeah, there you go.
And here we are.
So welcome.
It's great.
Thanks so much for being here. And so, yes, all these young adults are with ASRC,
yes,
which is Autism Spectrum Resource Center in Connecticut. And very similar to your organization, they provide support for not only young adults affected by autism, but families and support groups and advocacy classes.
Yes, parent advocacy organizations. So we support parents in the community. We provide resources, information, networking, advocacy around the state, all sorts of things that our families need.
Okay, so today is basically just to find out kind of the basics about autism, because I know I'm also just as blind to autism and everything that comes with it as many people out there, I think. You know, I'm new to this. I'm not from the organization. You know, I'm just here as the host, and so you know, this is going to be interesting for me and I think many others out there also. So
absolutely.
I just want to start with kind of what is your definition of autism? What is autism?
Okay, well, I'll start out first by saying I am not a medical doctor.
Okay.
I'm a layperson, so I think that's important to say first. So I'll try to explain it in English, which might be very helpful. Autism, it's a neurobiological disorder. Okay, that affects three main areas: communication, socialization, and behavior. And it's very important to understand that it's a neurobiological disorder. It is not a mental illness. It is not caused by a virus or some sort of medical disease.
It's not a sickness.
Sickness, exactly, as you might think of sickness. It is something that is different about neurobiology. So it's a brain difference.
A brain difference. Okay, something different in the brain. And were you going to say something else?
Yes, and I was going to say the other important aspect is that there have to be issues, impairments, inefficiencies, however you want to describe it, in those three domains: socialization, communication, and behavior. You need all three to get one of the autism spectrum diagnoses. Okay,
so I was just going to ask, what are some characteristics of autism? And you kind of just said it. It's kind of like it's a social... Would you call it a social disorder or a social awkwardness?
The social piece is probably the most prominent piece that you see.
Or the part you see.
Exactly.
The part you can notice.
Exactly. For a person who, again, we all look the same.
Right.
Nobody's looking any different. That would probably be the first thing you might see. For a person who's more significantly impaired, the first thing you might see would be the communication issues. If they didn't have any verbal speech or had minimal verbal speech, you might notice that, obviously, more than the socialization piece.
So what would you say causes autism then?
Oh, now if I had the answer to that, I'd be on a beach in Hawaii. I wouldn't be here in Cheshire on a Saturday morning.
Is there not? There's no definitive answer?
Nobody knows what causes autism. Autism was first labeled. It wasn't really discovered. It obviously always existed. We just didn't have a word for it until the 1940s. And we've been doing research since then and haven't come up with the answer yet. So it's clearly very complicated and complex.
Okay. And would you say autism is common? Would you label it as that? You know, is
the prevalence rates are very, very high. Currently, I think the numbers are about 1 in 100 or 1 in 110. That's a lot of people. When you include the broader autism spectrum, those on what people often term sort of the higher functioning, I hate that term, but people who are more capable of functioning within the neurotypical environment, as well as those that are more severely impaired.
I just want to interject here kind of, because I was even confused last week when I was talking to someone what the autism spectrum is, because I learned of that word when I came to ASRC, and I thought of the autism spectrum as the organization and nothing else.
And nothing else,
so what is the autism spectrum? You know, how would you describe
that gets us back to the diagnosis. Autism is under a subsection called pervasive developmental disorders. Nice big long word. And there are actually 5 pervasive developmental disorders, 3 of which are the autism spectrum disorders. And those would be your classic autism, what we all probably tend to think of when we think of autism, somebody with minimal communication skills, maybe also with an intellectual disability. Then you have the ones that are more higher functioning, might be on the Asperger's syndrome. And then kind of in the middle, something called pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, which means you're not in classic autism and you don't qualify for Asperger's, but you've got issues in those 3 areas.
The other.
Exactly, exactly. So we like to think of it more as a spectrum rather than discrete.
So it's different levels. The
one way to look at it.
Spectrum is the autism range, the different levels people can be affected by autism with.
Exactly, because everybody's autism is different. I have a good friend who describes autism like Swiss cheese. All Swiss cheese is cheese with holes in it, but each piece has the holes in a different spot. One way to think
some
about
smaller
it.
And some bigger.
Some smaller, some bigger, and we got to figure out where those holes are in that particular slice.
Okay, so that's interesting, and that's something that I just don't think anyone really knows what the autism spectrum is. Like I had no idea.
That's good.
So to me, it was the organization.
Well, it is the organization too.
It's all so just going back to that previous question about how common autism is, do you think it's gotten more common over the years? Would you say, or do you think?
As I said, my personal belief, if you want to put it that way, or understanding is autism has always been there. We just haven't had a word to describe it, and we haven't always had an interest in describing it. Our culture is very interested in describing people. We like to put people into their little categories. So we've come up with new categories for them. For example, Asperger's syndrome, which I referred to, wasn't an actual diagnosis until 1994. Well, there were people who had Asperger's syndrome or who would qualify for that. We just didn't call them that. We called them eccentric Uncle Eddie. We didn't have a label. So I don't necessarily think that, I think not necessarily is there more of it. I think we're more aware and we're more likely to give people
So is this a lack of knowledge before?
A lack of awareness of differences.
Lack of awareness, So not necessarily lack of autism.
Autism's always been there.
Right. So this is kind of my personal question, who's affected by autism? And the part that I kind of am curious about is you always hear about it in kids or young adults, and you don't see it in adults. What does that mean?
Well, it's there in adults, but again, if you think about the idea that we weren't giving people labels until more recently, certainly anybody in their 50s or 60s is Weird Uncle Eddie, as opposed to, actually having a label. And also for those who are more severely impaired or impacted by their autism, they may have been classified as mentally retarded or cognitively impaired, and so sort of pushed into that realm rather than given the label of autism as well. So we may not see them. When I was growing up, you didn't see kids with disabilities in your classrooms like you do now. They were down. I'm not sure where they were. I don't think they were down in the basement. But I'm not exactly sure. Where were all those kids?
Where were they?
They existed. We just didn't see them. And now I think we see them more. So you are going to see more in the younger kids. They're going to have the labels, whereas the older adults are not.
So before it wasn't, it was just all clumped into kind of
clumped in together or institutionalized, or we didn't know a lot, so much more than we know now.
Right, and I learned this, that mentally retarded that's not the correct term anymore. It's
intellectually disabled.
Yes, right. Okay.
Yes. No, they do change that all the time. Exactly.
It's always changing. So I feel like most of the adults now that are autistic, before in school, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, they were all just clumped into that intellectual disability.
Absolutely. I think about distant family members who are twins. who are adults. And certainly when they were first diagnosed, everybody just assumed they were intellectually disabled. And we didn't have ways of teaching speech or teaching language or communication skills